The kind of tired Dennis Carver carried wasn't the kind that sleep fixed. It settled in the shoulders. Mostly. That particular weight that comes from years of holding everything together with both hands while the world keeps piling more on top. He'd been tired like this for 3 years now. Since the February morning when the hospital called and the nurse's voice on the other end was careful in that specific way that told him everything before she said a word. Clara had been gone before he got there. An aneurysm, they said, sudden. Nothing anyone could have done. He'd stood in the hospital corridor in his work boots and his Carhartt jacket with engine grease still under his fingernails, and he'd had to call his sister-in-law to come stay with Poppy because he didn't trust himself to drive home. Poppy was 7 now. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she still sometimes left her shoes in the middle of the kitchen floor the way Clara used to. And Dennis would almost say something before he remembered who he was about to say it to. He worked at Harlan Auto and Fleet on Route 9, outside of Denton, Ohio. Had worked there for 11 years. He could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone. Not a party trick, just something that had accumulated over time. A fluency he'd developed the way some people develop an ear for music. The other mechanics knew it. The customers knew it. Terry Harlan, who owned the shop, knew it too, which was why he paid Dennis exactly what he'd been paying him in 2019 and told himself that was a fair wage. Dennis hadn't pushed back. He didn't push back on much anymore. There was a version of him before Clara died that would have walked into Terry's office and laid out the numbers and made a case. But that version felt like someone he used to know. The opportunity at Voss Industrial had come through a job board, and he almost didn't apply. The posting asked for a certified mechanical engineer with a 4-year degree, and Dennis had 2 years of community college and 11 years of doing the work that degreed engineers sometimes made worse by overthinking. He applied anyway, mostly because Poppy had mentioned wanting to take swimming lessons. And the kind Dennis could afford were the kind held in a community center pool that smelled like old rubber and chlorine, that hadn't been changed since the Clinton administration. The interview was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 9. On Wednesday evening, Dennis dropped Poppy at his mother's place, drove 40 minutes to Granger to pick up a part for a customer's truck he'd promised would be ready Friday, and stopped at a diner called Ruthie's on the way back. Because he hadn't eaten since noon and his hands had started that low tremor they did when his blood sugar dropped. He sat at the counter. It was quiet for 7:30. A couple of truckers in a booth, an old man nursing coffee at the far end, the particular hush of a Wednesday diner that knows it isn't anyone's first choice for the evening. He ordered a burger and coffee and looked at the job description on his phone for the 4th time that day, trying to decide if he should rehearse answers, or if rehearsed answers always sounded like rehearsed answers, which in his experience they did. That was when he heard it. Not loudly. The acoustics of the diner were such that the corner booth behind him carried sound in a way the rest of the room didn't, and what he heard was a woman's voice, low, measured, the voice of someone choosing words very carefully, saying, "I think I'd actually like to go now." And a man's voice, not low, not measured at all, saying, "We haven't even finished eating. Relax." Dennis didn't turn around. He wasn't the type to catalog other people's evenings. But he did stop looking at his phone. "I'm not feeling well," the woman said. "You seemed fine 20 minutes ago." There was a silence, and then the sound of a glass being set down too hard. "You know, I really don't need this. I just need you to..." "Need me to what? You've been on your phone half the night. If you didn't want to be here, you shouldn't have agreed to come." Dennis looked at the pass-through window to the kitchen. Ruthie's had a clock above it, one of those round diner clocks with the red second hand. He watched the second hand move. He thought about what Clara would have done. He knew, actually. There was no question. Clara would have already been doing something. She had that quality, an immediate, practical kindness that didn't waste time on deliberation, because the deliberating was just another way of doing nothing. He turned around. The woman in the corner booth was maybe 35, brown hair pulled back, a blazer that suggested she'd come from work, or somewhere that required a blazer, and she was sitting with her back very straight in the way people sit when they're holding themselves together deliberately. The man across from her was leaning back with his arms crossed, and the particular expression of someone who thinks being publicly unreasonable is a kind of power. Dennis picked up his coffee, walked over, and said, "Hey, sorry to interrupt. I thought that was you." She looked up at him. He could see her trying to place him and coming up with nothing, which was correct. "I've been sitting up at the counter waiting," he said, and he kept his tone easy, kept his eyes friendly, kept the whole thing entirely unremarkable. "We said 7:30, right?" She looked at him for 1 beat, 2 beats, and then something shifted in her face. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition of what was being offered. "That's right," she said. "I'm sorry, I lost track of time." The man across from her unfolded his arms. "You know this guy? We work together," she said, and she reached under the table for her bag with the calm efficiency of someone who'd already decided this was how the evening was going to end. The man said something else. Dennis didn't particularly process it. He kept his attention on the woman, kept his posture relaxed, kept himself between her and the booth until she was standing. "I'm really sorry," she said to the man, and she didn't sound sorry at all, and Dennis respected that. They walked toward the counter together. He paid for his coffee. The burger had arrived while he was in the booth, and he left cash that covered both, and they stepped outside into the April air, which was still cold enough that their breath was visible. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at him. "I don't know you," she said. "No, you said you wanted to leave," Dennis said. Seemed like you needed a reason he'd accept. She looked at him for a long moment. A car went by on the street. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something only the dog could see. "Thank you," she said. "Sure. No, I mean..." She stopped, started again. "He wasn't going to hurt me or anything. It was just a very bad date that I couldn't seem to get out of gracefully." "You got out," Dennis said. She smiled at that. It was the kind of smile that arrives slightly against a person's will. "I'm Audra," she said. "Dennis, are you from Granger?" "Denton, I was just passing through for a job." She nodded. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask. They stood there a moment longer in the way that strangers stand when the thing that connected them is already past, and there isn't much left to say. "Well," she said. "I hope the job goes well." "Thank you," he said. "Take care of yourself." He walked back to his truck. He sat there for a minute before starting it, not thinking about anything in particular. Or rather, thinking about Clara the way he often did in the spaces between things, the way she existed now not as an absence, but as a kind of quiet presence in the decisions he made, the way he hoped he was making them the way she would have approved of. Then he drove back to Denton, and he went over the job description one more time, and he went to bed at 11:15 and slept the moderate sleep of a man who has too much on his mind to sleep deeply and too much exhaustion not to sleep at all. He arrived at Voss Industrial at 8:52 the next morning. The building was newer than he'd expected. Glass and steel in the way that industrial buildings had started to go, functional, but with the self-consciousness of a company that wanted to look a certain way. He'd worn his good clothes, which meant a dark jacket and slacks that still fit from Clara's cousin's wedding 4 years ago, and he'd had his mother take a look at him before he left her place with Poppy. She'd straightened his collar and said, "You look like your father," when he interviewed at the plant. He didn't know if that was a compliment or just an observation, but he'd taken it as something he needed. The receptionist sent him to the 3rd floor. He signed in, was given a visitor badge, and was shown to a waiting area with chairs that cost more than his kitchen table and a view of the parking lot through floor-to-ceiling windows. He was the only one waiting. At 9:03, a door opened. He heard her before he turned. He heard the sound of a specific kind of professional walk. Heels, deliberate, unhurried, and he turned because that was the natural thing to do. And for a half-second that felt considerably longer, he and the woman from the diner the night before looked at each other across a waiting room at Voss Industrial in Granger, Ohio. She was in a different blazer. Her hair was down now. She was carrying a leather portfolio and a coffee that was not from the building's lobby machine, and she had the composed, calibrated expression of someone who had spent years learning to keep her face readable only when she chose to let it be. He watched her clock him. He watched her process it. He stood. "Mr. Carver," she said. "Ems." He stopped. He didn't know her last name. "Audra Pemberton," she said. "I'm the director of operations." She extended her hand and he shook it. Her grip was what you'd expect, firm, brief, entirely professional. "I'll be conducting your interview today." "Okay," Dennis said. There was a beat, not long, 2 seconds at most, where the situation existed between them as a fact, and neither of them did anything with it. Then she said, "Follow me," and he did. The conference room was the kind that has a long table and too many chairs and a whiteboard that someone has cleaned until it's slightly gray. She sat at the head and he sat 2 chairs down at an angle that felt appropriate for an interview, not so close as to be presumptuous. She set the portfolio on the table. She set the coffee to the side. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has agreed, without anyone saying so explicitly, to start fresh. "You applied for the senior maintenance engineer position," she said. "I did. Your resume doesn't list a 4-year degree." "No, I have an associate's from Hartwell Community College. I also have 11 years in fleet maintenance at a commercial shop, a background in hydraulics and electrical diagnostics, and..." He'd almost said, "And I think I can do this job," but he stopped himself, because that was the kind of thing that sounded better inside your own head. "I've managed a caseload that averaged 47 vehicles a week for the last 4 years. I can give you specifics if that's useful." She wrote something. He couldn't see what. "Tell me about a time when you identified a problem that wasn't technically your job to fix," she said. He looked at her. The question, he understood, was a standard one, the kind of behavioral question that HR departments loved and that most candidates answered with a story they'd prepared. He understood this. He also understood, sitting in this specific room across from this specific person, that the question had an additional weight to it that had nothing to do with HR departments. He thought about giving the prepared answer. He had one. A situation at Harlan's 2 years ago where he'd caught a brake line issue on a school bus that had come in for something else entirely, caught it before it became something that put children in danger. He told that story instead. He told it plainly, without ornament, the way it had actually happened. The noise that didn't belong, the decision to check it even though the work order didn't call for it, the conversation with Terry afterward that had been more awkward than triumphant because Terry didn't love being told about problems that had slipped by. Audra Pemberton listened without interrupting. She wrote 3 things while he talked. She looked at him when he finished. "And why did you stop to check?" she said. "Because the noise didn't make sense for what they'd brought it in for," he said. "And the bus had a school district sticker on the back." She nodded once. "What would you have done if it had been a vehicle with no sticker?" He thought about that, honestly. "Probably the same thing," he said. "But I won't pretend the sticker didn't make me move faster." She almost smiled. He could see it in the vicinity of her expression without it quite arriving. She asked him about load stress calculations, and he answered. She asked about his familiarity with the specific systems Voss ran, and he was honest about the ones he knew and clear about the ones he'd need to learn and how long that would realistically take. She didn't write anything during that part. She just listened. 40 minutes in, she closed the portfolio. "One more question," she said. "And I want you to answer it the way you'd actually answer it, not the way you think I want to hear. All right. If you had known last night who I was, what this building was, that I was going to be sitting across from you this morning, would you have done anything differently?" The room was quiet. Out the window, A truck was backing into a loading dock, with that particular reversing beep that Dennis had heard 10,000 times in his life. He considered the question the way it deserved to be considered. "No," he said. "Why not?" "Because the reason I did it had nothing to do with what came after," he said. "And if I'd known who you were and done it anyway, it would have been for a different reason. It would have been a transaction. What it actually wasn't." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was necessary for a professional exchange. Then she said, "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Carver. We'll be in touch within the week." She stood. He stood. She extended her hand again, and he shook it again. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said. "Audra," she said. And then, as if she'd said it by accident, she picked up her portfolio and her coffee, and walked toward the door in the same composed, unhurried way she'd come in. He drove back to Denton. His mother had Poppy dressed and ready, backpack on, standing by the door with the particular energy of a 7-year-old, who has been waiting patiently for 40 minutes, and is now barely containing it. She launched herself at him when he opened the door and he caught her, which he always did, which he intended to keep doing as long as his back held out. "How'd it go?" his mother asked. "I don't know," he said, and that was the truth. He genuinely didn't know. He didn't sleep well that night, or the next. He did the work at Harlan's. He fixed an alternator, a transmission seal, a fuel injector on a truck that had no business still running and ran anyway through some combination of luck and stubbornness that Dennis respected. He picked Poppy up from school. He made the dinners he knew how to make, and he sat with her while she did her homework, and he read to her until she fell asleep, the same chapter book they'd been working through for 3 weeks. And then he sat in the kitchen in the quiet and drank coffee he didn't really need, and thought about things he couldn't do anything about. On Tuesday, his phone rang with a number he didn't have saved. "Mr. Carver." Audra Pemberton's voice was different on the phone, slightly less guarded, or maybe just in different proportion. "I'd like to offer you the position if you're still interested." He was quiet for a moment. "I am," he said. "The salary is." She named a number that was 30% more than what Terry Harlan was paying him, plus benefits that included, he would later discover, a dependent health plan that covered Poppy's annual checkups and the swimming lessons she'd been asking about. "I have to give 2 weeks' notice," Dennis said. "Of course. And I want to be clear. I'm going to need time on the learning curve with your specific systems. I told you that in the interview, and I meant it." "I know," she said. "That's why we're offering a 30-day ramp period." He looked around his kitchen. The shoes by the door. Poppy's, this time, though for one split second, as always, he checked. The clock on the microwave. The stack of mail he hadn't opened because nothing in it was good news. "Then yes," he said. "I'd like to take the position." There was a brief professionalism, dates, an HR email he'd be receiving, nothing that crossed any line, nothing that needed to. Before she hung up, there was a pause, small, the kind that in a business call usually means nothing. "Mr. Carver," she said. "Dennis," he said. Another pause. "Dennis," she said. "Thank you. For last night, I mean. I should have said it more clearly at the time." He thought about the diner, the cold April air, the dog barking somewhere down the block. "You said it fine," he said. She said goodbye, and he set the phone on the table and looked at it for a moment the way you look at things when something has shifted and you're still catching up to the shift. He didn't know what came next. He knew that the job started in 2 weeks. He knew that Poppy wanted to learn butterfly stroke and that the community pool 3 miles from the new workplace had a Thursday evening class. He knew that whatever came next would come the way things always came, one day at a time, in small increments, without fanfare. He knew that Clara, wherever she was, would have said, "That was exactly right." He got up, opened the back door, and stood for a moment in the evening air. The neighborhood was quiet in the specific way of Tuesday evenings in mid-spring. A lawnmower somewhere distant, a kid on a bicycle, the light that comes at 6 o'clock in April, that's somehow both tired and gentle at once. He thought about the bus with the school district sticker. He thought about a diner on Route 9 in Granger, where he'd left cash on the counter for a burger he never finished. He thought about a question in a conference room that had been worth giving a real answer to. He'd done a small, ordinary thing. He'd done it without thinking too hard about it, because the woman had said she wanted to leave and it seemed like a reasonable thing to make that possible. That was the whole of it, really. That had been enough.